Good evening and welcome to the Monroe Church of Christ Midweek Bible Study. I am Derek Glover here at the Monroe Church of Christ, and we welcome all of you from all over the place that are joining us this evening as we study and continue to study the book of Romans as written by the Apostle Paul. As we've worked our way through this letter, we have noted its purpose and its timing, that Paul wrote this to the Christians who were in a particular place in Rome. And in that place, they were dealing with a problem, and that was the really mixed ethnicity of their churches and of their fellowship. And that created some difficulties, and that's okay. I think it's important that we we state and make note of the fact that it's okay that we're different sometimes. God made all of us, and He loves all of us, and He calls all of us to Him, but He doesn't call us to Him with a prerequisite that we all be alike. There's no test of purity when it comes to us physically, our nationality or things like that. He calls all people, rich and poor, of every color and every creed, but we do have differences, and we are going to find cultural differences and socioeconomic differences and political differences amongst us. And this letter really is a wonderful roadmap in how we manage those things. And he begins, as Paul writes, and we've stressed this before, he writes in a very classically Greek rhetorical manner. He writes building a premise upon a premise upon a premise that is to lead the reader or the listener to the point and to proper conclusion. And he does that by establishing the fact that Jews and Gentiles are now a part of the body of believers. Early on, it was mostly Jews, those who were present at Pentecost, and those who were influenced by them as they were scattered out from Jerusalem because of persecution. In fact, persecution that Paul himself, when he was known as Saul, was a part of. So as it spread amongst the Jews, there came a time when it was then given to the Gentiles. And when the gospel was given to Cornelius and his household as a sign that God welcomed all people to him through Christ. And Paul talks about that here. That was the opening of the door, the engrafting of the branches, the adoption of the children into a larger understanding of God's people. And that was all people who would come to him through the perfect sacrifice and the perfect high priest known as Jesus. So he builds upon this premise, the idea that we're sinners. We're sinners, and there's no way around that fact. Jews, Gentiles, whatever you are all sinners. And you're saved by one thing alone. It's the grace of God through Jesus Christ. It's not going to be your law that saves you for the Jews. It's not going to be their keeping of the law that saves them. And if they want to choose to continue to pursue that, they will continue to suffer the pitfalls that were present for their ancestors in trying to do just that. It won't be by your own merit. It won't be by what you deserve. It will be by what is given to you by God through Christ. So he builds upon that and builds into this concept of justification by faith, righteousness that comes by faith. He talks about how even if you go back and look at the Old Testament, at the ancient scriptures that the Jews would have known and followed, it was talked about. It was referenced that they had lost the thread on that. They had lost their focus on it. And Moses himself spoke of it. We see that in chapter 10. We move through chapter 11 and 12, and I consider that to be, in my estimation, kind of the thesis or the conclusion, the climax of the point, because he talks about living together and working together and fellowshipping with one another. And that this is the result of the fact that we all accept our position in life as being lost without Christ, really lost without a relationship with God, but that's facilitated through Christ. And so as we concluded chapter 12, he talks about how you get along with one another. And this is important because these next 13, 14, 15, and 16, that's what's left in this letter of Romans. And as we go through those and we talk about those chapters, you're going to see that he drifts further away from the main point, and he's going into some extra things, some side points. Paul does that a lot. He's making a point, and he goes over and says, while I'm dealing with this, let me talk to you about this subject, and then he comes back. He's going to deal with some very specific things. Remember as we read this The Bible was not written to us, it was written for us. These letters that we have show us how Paul applied the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the audience in question. And we have to look at it that way. Otherwise, we are at risk of making some pretty wrong conclusions, and proof texting and things like that are the result of that kind of study. We want to look at it in the context it was applied and see how that relates to us. And we're going to try to do that as faithfully as we can. But remember always the purpose of the letter and what he is writing about. He's writing about Jews and Gentiles who share a faith, but they're struggling to share a fellowship. So he's talked about making themselves a living sacrifice and seeing one another as parts of a body. You're all different. You all have different purposes, but you're all needed, and you're all part of the same body. And we need to lean into our strengths and our weaknesses. And he's going to come back in chapters 14 and 15 to dealing with this issue of what do we do when we have differences. We could say that thus far, he has given us very much inspired and true revelations about the gospel and about faith and about how we are connected to one another. But what does it mean in practical terms? Because we are going to disagree. We are going to have matters of conscience. We're going to have some stark differences in how we understand and how we manifest that relationship with God. So what do we actually do about it? Well, Paul's going to talk about that. And again, as we read it, we want to put it in its proper context and understand what that means for us and the things that we face. But chapter 13 is one of those tangential kind of chapters. And remember, the chapters are man-made, okay? Paul was writing, and he goes off into something else, and it probably seems out of place if you think about it in chapter context, but if you read it all without all the divisions in it, it might make a little more sense. Because consider how he ends chapter 12. He talks about how you're dealing with one another as members of the same body, different, but all with their own gifts and strengths. And then he says in verse 14, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Now, he goes from talking about dealing with one another to also the persecutors. That might indicate those on the outside. Could be those on the inside that give you grief for your particular point of view or your particular way of doing things, but it most often refers to people on the outside that are causing trouble. So when we get to chapter 13, that's not really out of place because he talks about how to deal with people. Verse 19 of chapter 12 says, never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. That's an interesting way to phrase that. He says, don't go about trying to fight your battles for yourself. Because, again, just like the rest of this book, don't inject yourself into something God is doing. Don't get in the way of where God is moving. That's what they were trying to do. The Jews were trying to do it by keeping their law and requiring their law on even the Gentiles as a prerequisite for their Christian faith. He says, don't do that. You're injecting your own ideas of righteousness and merit and deserving of grace into this process. God is moving with these people, with you, and you're injecting yourself with the keeping of the law. Don't inject yourself into the process of salvation that God has laid out for you. And again, he does that here when it comes to dealing with other people, even those who intend to do you harm, even those who will hurt you. Don't inject yourself into the process of fighting back. Okay? Now, are there times where we're going to stand up for ourselves? Yeah, absolutely. Are there times where we can be bold in defending ourselves and our faith? Sure. I don't think the church is a group that has any virtue in getting pushed around. We're not a doormat for the rest of the world, but we do represent and demonstrate Christ's attitude in how we live. And that includes how we respond. He says, leave room for God. Leave room for God. The people that are doing you harm, that are seeking to do you wrong, I know you want to get back at them. I know you want to fight them. I know you want to get them where it hurts. It's like the Untouchables movie from the mid-'80s, Kevin Costner and Sean Connery, and they have that scene where they're in the church. And Sean Connery's character is telling Kevin Costner, you've got to be willing to do some things outside your comfort zone in order to get Al Capone. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. You might remember that scene. He's saying, you got to one up. Well, Paul is saying the opposite here. He says, don't go into conflict looking at it that way. Leave room for God to work. When you fight your battles, fight them with gentleness, kindness, and love, as Jesus would have done, and he did, and leave room for God to do some work. When we would say, most people that understand the New Testament and practice New Testament Christianity would say that it would be foolish to suggest that we are somehow in control by our merit of our eternal salvation. Now, we have free will, but to say that we can do enough good things above and beyond the bad things we're going to do, that we can get in, that we're going to make it into heaven. We think it's foolish. That's not our theology. We believe we're covered by the grace of God through Jesus Christ. So as much as we believe in leaving room for God to work, then also in our day-to-day interactions with people, even our enemies, we must leave room for God to work. Who says we have to get the satisfaction of getting the last word, or having the last say, or the last laugh? Who is to say that we only win when we come out on top in the argument, or when we get back at someone who's done us wrong? That's the world's definition of winning. That's not God's definition of winning. We cover up and mask and tarnish and obscure the glory of God and the power of God when we try to do things on our own. And so in every other aspect, I think we believe this, but when it comes to things like revenge, we may not use that word, but when it comes to fighting or getting back or winning, we sometimes don't obey that way. We don't live that way. And I think we get into the mindset that we're supposed to be soldiers for the Lord, and this is His will that we fight in this way, but it's not always the case. And there is a difference between standing up in boldness and in truth for who we are and who Jesus is, and in taking the place of God when it comes to how we fight back. So Paul says, leave room for God. Now remember, he's just talked about people that persecute you, and you're going to show kindness to them when they don't. Okay, when they hurt you, when they persecute you, don't curse them, but repay them good rather than evil. That's how he ends the chapter. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. He even says, feed your enemies. They're hungry. And give them drink if they're thirsty. Show kindness, even to those who hate you. Don't seek revenge thinking that is victory. All you've done there is stepped on God's toes. And that generally doesn't work out in the evidence of history. So don't be, never take revenge, beloved. Leave room for the wrath of God. Let God sort it out. Let God handle it. Now, as we transition into chapter 13, keep that in mind. We're not leaving one subject and going to another. This is a free-flowing thing here, that as Paul writes it. He's just said how we're to deal with those on the outside that throw stones at us. And he says, you don't throw stones back. Even people on the inside that throw stones, we don't throw stones back. And he says in chapter 13, verse 1, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. This might be one of the toughest verses in Scripture. And there's a few reasons why. Number one is cultural for us, particularly those of us who live in the United States. We have a history of freedom for religious points of view, even the ones we disagree with. Now, people say we're a Christian nation. We were founded on Judeo-Christian values, and I think that's largely historically accurate, because those were the generally accepted values of the time based on, who was running things. But it may not always be the case. Certainly doesn't seem to be the case today that we're governed by those things. So those things will change, but we were given a freedom to exercise what we believe and to practice our faith. It was one of the points of origin for our country, for our nation. And because we have that, we also have to battle and wrestle with this kind of tension that exists between the religious community and the state or the government. And in my life, I don't know that I have seen that played out quite as much, or quite as, literally, as it has been in the last year. When this pandemic started, and it depends on what state you were living in or the conditions you were facing, but the vast majority of places of worship, and it wouldn't just be exclusively Christian, all of them, were forced to close or change in some way how they operated, because we're talking about bringing people into a building and sitting close to each other and singing and praying. And so a lot of churches closed. And we do things like this now, and that's great. That's fine. I have struggled with the idea. Is that okay? Is it okay to let the government tell us we can't do this? You look at the New Testament, you see there was persecution. They were told not to meet. They were told not to worship and talk about Jesus, but they did it anyway. There is going to be this tension we're going to have to wrestle with here, even in this chapter, as we have in the last year. I think a lot of Christians have had a conflict of conscience about it. We're told we can't go to church. Is that even okay for the government to do that from a constitutional legal perspective? Okay, that's a good question. Because we've always had this freedom of religion. And it doesn't say you have that freedom unless there's a global pandemic. So what are we to do about this? And then there's also the question of, is it okay if we do that? If we capitulate, if we say, okay, we're going to obey the law and the regulation and we're going to do what we're told, is that okay? Are we aiding and abetting this persecution of faith? See, this is probably the closest I've ever witnessed this battle actually taking place. And it has to do with our history and our culture. We've always had the freedom, but we've always had to wrestle with where are the lines drawn between the government, which is supposed to protect our religious freedom, and our religion. And we call it the separation of church and state, which comes from a phrase that Thomas Jefferson used in a letter. And what he intended to say was that the government is not going to establish a state church like England had, the Church of England. We're not going to require fealty to a particular denomination. It's freedom. You're allowed to worship how you want to worship and who you want to worship. And sometimes we don't like that because there's people who worship things we don't agree with. But by them having their freedom, we have our freedom, and we've kind of operated that way. But we do have this balance of equities, I call it, between having to practice our faith and try to influence the world around us, but not do it through the means of our elected officials necessarily. Now, I know there are Christians who are very passionate and involved in the political process, and they want to see change happen at a legislative level. I say more power to them. That's fine if that's how you choose to try and strengthen those areas. There's been a lot of disagreement in the history of the Churches of Christ, particularly over this. You can look at David Lipscomb. He thought it was sinful for Christians to vote or to be involved in any way in the political process, and he had some personal reasons for that. Don't know that it was clearly theological, but there's been a lot of disagreement in our tribe about how involved we're to be. So this relationship with government and governing authorities and the church has always been kind of simmering. It was simmering in the founding of our country. It has continued to simmer at times. We have this wonderful little balance that we try to strike, and we don't always get it right. We have challenges. So we have that separation, and that is a cultural thing that's ingrained in us, the freedom, the separation, and that cultural thing that's ingrained in us. We tend to think, hey, yes, we have to obey laws as good citizens, but they don't get to tell us what to do. There's a line somewhere. So when we read this verse, it is inherently colored by our experience in the United States of America with the First Amendment in our Constitution. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. To read that as an American is hard, because I look at that and go, no, wait a minute, I'm fine with the fact that we have a government, but well, I've always kind of had in my mind, yes, we have a government, but God is the final say in my life. And if they ever tell me to do something that's contrary to what God tells me to do, I'm going to choose God. And we actually were faced with that kind of question in the last year. Many bodies of faithful people and religious people were faced with it. Never really thought I would be. That's my privilege living in America. It's not the privilege of people all over the world. And it wasn't the privilege of those who Paul is writing to. They definitely have a government that exerts a lot more control over their life than what we are used to. They have a government that is not always friendly, and currently was not friendly to Christianity in particular, and wouldn't be for a while. And so, what were they doing? And why is Paul saying this? Well, remember the context. He's talking about how do we live with one another, and then how do we live with everybody else? How do we operate in this world that is often contrary to our values and God's will? And he says, okay, you need to be in subjection to the governing authorities. Remember, he's just talked about living at peace, and that's the theme here. The gospel spreads best when you have conducive conditions for it. When you have the conditions where you're allowed to move about freely, where you're allowed to speak and share with people. And we see in other parts of the world where it's very difficult to spread Christianity because there are barriers to it, legal, political, what have you. We're very fortunate here that we have essentially a very free society where we're allowed to do this. But Paul's talking about having peace with one another in the church, accepting one another, loving one another, having peace with the community around us. Those who are our enemies, who persecute us, we return to them with kindness and love. And now when it comes to the government, what Paul is saying is not capitulate to the government if they are anti-God. He's not saying, be a doormat, lay down, prostrate yourself before the state. What he is saying, I don't think Paul is in any way backtracking from God is superior. In fact, he emphasizes it. What he is saying is, you should live at peace. Essentially what he's saying is, the church is not designed to be a political activist organization. That's not who we are designed to be. We are not going to change the world or transform the world in the name of Jesus Christ by legislating it. Now, I know that's hard for some of us because many faithful Christians vote with their faith. They support legislation with their faith. They want to see certain things done or established or overturned on the basis of their faith. We talk about wanting to return to a Christian nation. I've got news for you. That's not what our job is. If it happens, wonderful. Would I prefer a government that legislates on the basis of my values and my faith? Yeah, to some degree, I think I would. I think there's a danger sometimes in that because it can very quickly go the other way on you. But for the most part, I come back to this verse and I say, the Great Commission did not say go into all the world and elect the right candidates. He didn't say go into all the world and run for office and pass laws that outlaw sin. I mean, we can do that, but does that get rid of sin? Does that create a perfect society? No. And that's exactly what Paul's saying. We do not fulfill the Great Commission by establishing a theocracy. We don't fulfill the Great Commission by creating the perfect Christian society or world. Sin always exists. We will not win and fulfill that Great Commission by creating some sort of pseudo-political heaven on earth. That's not what we're here to do. Believe what you want to believe. Vote how you want to vote. Be active in the way you want to be active, okay? If you're doing it for the glory of God, I support you and applaud you because I believe God accepts that which you do on His behalf according to His will. But Paul does not seem to be advocating. In fact, I think he's specifically speaking against the idea of political revolution or political activism as a means of fulfilling the Great Commission. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. Plain and simple. If you want to live at peace with one another, here's how you do it. If you want to live at peace with your community, show love and kindness. Don't throw stones back. If you want to live at peace in your world, you need to obey the law. We are not designed to be a body of political dissidents. We are designed to be a body of servants of the Lord, demonstrating the love and grace of Jesus. He says here in this first verse, there is no authority except from God. So he does emphasize God is above all. God is the ultimate authority. We will follow God. We will obey God. We will not let the government tell us we can't worship God or that we can't have this faith. We're going to stand up. They were martyred. They were persecuted. They suffered all sorts of things. Paul himself did. But so as much as they're going to be steadfast in their faith, the proper way of, if you will, proselytizing is not going to be through political transformation. That's his point. Don't be a disruptor. Don't be a part of rebellion. Be someone who lives in peace. And that means obeying the law, showing respect to authority. It's okay to do that. Even if they don't like you and what you believe, it's okay because God is still in charge. And I know there's different lines, and everybody has a different line that they draw for themselves, and that's okay too. But just remember, keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing is sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with anyone who will listen, who needs to hear it. Now, how do you think that's best done? Is that best done from a jail cell? Not usually. It's best done when you have the freedom to move about and speak to people and share the gospel. So Paul's just speaking very practically here. Don't get hung up on thinking that our battle is with the political establishment. Our battle is not with the government. Okay? Our battle is with Satan. Our battle is with evil. And in order to battle it, we must be free to do so. So live in peace with the world around you. Be in subjection to the governing authorities. There's no authority except God, and he says those which exist, that's the governments and the authorities around you, are established by God. Okay, now we have another. So we just somehow maybe managed to work through a little bit the first half of that verse and come to some conclusions, and now we have this one. That those that exist are established by God? Did God put Donald Trump in the White House? Did God put Joe Biden in the White House? Did God put Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler in power? Did he put Saddam Hussein or the Ayatollah in power? Did he put Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un in power? Did God put in place the apartheid government of South Africa in the past? This is a difficult verse because we're asked to accept something here. There's nothing that exists except what's established by God. I think it's important not to, again, dive too literally into that, but also to remember the audience and remember the context. They're talking about the Roman government. And he says you should be in subjection to the governing authorities. Your battle is not with political revolution, okay, or military revolution. Your battle is with evil, and that is overcome with the gospel. Keep the main thing the main thing. What authorities exist out there? Well, God is the ultimate authority, but everything else that exists is established by God. I don't believe that means he literally puts certain people in power. I don't believe that literally means he establishes nations or destroys nations. I think what it literally means is that God has given man the desire and the ability and the wherewithal to govern themselves in different ways in different times. Over human history, the evolution of government or legal systems or even just societal norms has evolved to a point, and we live in a far more egalitarian society than maybe has been in the past. And so we have a system, a government, and it's just saying God simply allows that to happen. He allows people to establish nations and draw borders and build governments and establish themselves for order. There is order in the world when we have those things. And where there is order, there is predictability, and where that exists, there are situations that are conducive, some easier than others, for sharing the gospel. And he's saying the battle is not with that, to overthrow that or fix that. The battle is with evil. Keep the main thing the main thing. So That which does exist, that which does govern our life and influence our life, that's established by God. God allows that to take place. And God has done that because human beings need order. It could be good order, like, democratic republics. It could be bad order, like, communist totalitarian dictators. But there's order and there's predictability. And God allows that to take place. Now look what else he says, because he goes on here and expands on this. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. You rebel against the authority, you're rebelling against the order that God has allowed to be established, which is ultimately to our benefit. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. You ever been driving along? It happens every time. I hate it. I honestly wish they would outlaw this. But when we go on family trips, we go back down to Arkansas, where I'm from, to see family, or Tennessee, where my wife's from. We're driving down the interstate. And I generally follow the speed limit more and more as I get older and have more kids. But also there's flow of traffic. And sometimes that traffic's going 75, 80 miles an hour. But even if I'm going 70 or under it, inevitably, we'll be driving along, traffic's kind of heavy, maybe it's a holiday weekend, and I see down the road, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Everybody hits their brakes. Whoa, we slow down to 60 miles an hour. We're 75, now we're down at 60 in a matter of feet. And as I get up there, I see there's the state trooper sitting in the median. Honestly, I think it's more dangerous that everyone responds by slowing down to 10 miles an hour below the speed limit when they see them. Why did we do that? It's a weird psychological thing. If you're going the speed limit, why worry? Why hit your brakes? Now, if I'm going above the speed limit, and sometimes I just sort of zone out, I'm not paying attention. I got a ticket out here on the highway, and it's 55 miles an hour out here. It's a 4-lane highway. And I was driving, I just wasn't even thinking. And I was driving a different vehicle than my daily driver was driving our family vehicle. I was going like 80. I didn't even realize it. I got pulled over, and I told him, I said, I just didn't know, I'm sorry. But if I think I'm doing wrong, and I see someone who has the potential to write me a ticket, boy, I slow down. I'm careful. I make sure I come to a full and complete stop. I make sure I have my seatbelt on. We do those things because we know there's consequences for breaking the rules. And Paul says, if you're not breaking rules, what are you afraid of? If you're not breaking the, if the IRS calls you and says they're going to audit you, you've been keeping everything on the up and up, why should you worry? That's what Paul's saying. There is authority, there is government, and we need to look at them as agents of God's will, not necessarily as political opponents to be defeated. We have to work in the parameters of this world that we're given, because we have the parameters we have here in the United States, which are far more free, even if we don't feel like it sometimes, than in China or in certain parts of Africa or even in Europe. It's a different context wherever you go, and it was different in Rome. So we have to take the principle that he's applying here to their context in Rome and apply it to ours. And that is, don't get caught up thinking God's will is some sort of political revolution. God's will is a spiritual revolution, to deliver the grace and mercy of God through Jesus Christ to those who need it through the preaching of the gospel. And look at the government around you as authority that God has in his patience and wisdom granted to mankind to establish some kind of order, for good or bad. When you oppose that order, you put yourself in danger of paying the price. So you've got nothing to fear from the government if you're abiding by their laws, if you're keeping the rules. You've got nothing to fear if you're doing right, living at peace with the world around you. Do you want to have no fear for authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is here we go, getting tougher. For it is a minister of God to you for good. The government is a minister of God to do me good. They want to bless me. They want to praise me. Why? Well, this is God saying, you know what? This is kind of goes the old saying we have, that be in the world and not of the world. We can obey the rules and live at peace and be peaceful, and not be giving over our faith and dedication to something other than God. We can serve God and live at peace with mankind. The gospel doesn't call us to be rabble-rousing revolutionaries. It just doesn't. It calls us to be bold and to take action, and it does call us at times to make the choice that this isn't right and we're going to do different even if it costs us. We definitely see people of God breaking rules, getting in trouble. I mean, Jesus did receive the death penalty. So we have to consider all of that and know that there's always a line. There's always where we have to make our choice, where our loyalty lies. But in our day-to-day and in how we're going to manifest our evangelism, that's the question. The question is not these outliers of what if the government told you they would kill you for worshiping God. Well, you worship God and you take whatever's coming. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about living at peace and how we go about our evangelism. Are we going to be disruptors that make enemies that we don't need? Or are we going to live at peace, have good reputations in our communities, and let that open doors for us? Paul seems to think in a practical way you do the latter, because there's nothing wrong with that, and God can use the order of established government to bless you with opportunity and to do good for you. So obey the laws, obey the rules, nothing wrong with it. You're not displacing God in your heart. You're simply seeking to live at peace to further his kingdom. And so you don't have to be afraid if you're doing what's right. And he says this, if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it is a minister of God, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. In other words, governments have power, they have authority, and they have ways to express that power. They have guns, or they have swords in this case. They have the power of punishment. They have a punitive power. And that's not for nothing. God uses that, again, to keep order. Now, some people use this verse to defend the death penalty as somehow endorsed by God. Again, you're taking God and you're laying a modern political template over the top of him and trying to shoehorn him into a subject you've already made a decision on. I don't think this is about the death penalty and God's preference on the death penalty. I think God is probably fairly indifferent to whatever our political whatever is. I think that he allows man to order itself through political means and governments, and that there will be blessings from that government and there will be punishments from that government at times. But what we should seek to do in our daily life is be respectful of that authority and its power to end our life or to make our life difficult or to take our liberty from us. We should be respectful of that power while also focusing on the purpose of our existence, and that is to share the gospel. It is not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. This is just a fact of life. If you do bad things, you go to jail. You don't want to go to jail. That's not good for the church. So, obey. It's okay. Be in subjection to the government and to its authority. Keep God above all as the authority for your life, and seek to do his will, but in all ways that you can, live at peace with the world around you. Okay? Live at peace with the world around you. Verse 5. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Paul makes the point, you need to be in a position to show love to your neighbor. You need to be in a position that people look to you in your community, in your family, even in amongst the governing authorities, and they look at you and say, that's someone that demonstrates love and kindness. They need to see what it is that motivates you in life, and that it's the love of God. And he says, if you love your neighbor, if you live in peace with those around you, you're fulfilling the law. Because all the law comes down to is take care of other people. Take care of, and really think about what is sin? In every possible definition of sin, it's selfishness. I want this. I want to do this and not that. I'm going to follow my own desire, my own want, my own goal. Selfishness is the heart of all sin. And selflessness is the heart of all grace. And fulfilling the law means loving one another. Verse 10, love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. If you're following God's law, very rarely are you going to come into conflict with the authorities around you. If you're loving one another, you're not going to have that conflict. Have there been times, could there possibly be times where we're going to be faced with that question? Certainly. And there's no easy answers. But I think Paul is demonstrating here, and I think our situation is probably easier than Rome was in the mid-first century, so I think we can safely say that when those arise, we need to consider very carefully the principle that Paul applies to that context and say, where's the line? What's the benefit? We have to think marginally a little bit and say, okay, what will this cost us to rebel against something that we think is contrary to God's will, or can we fulfill God's will while still maintaining peace with those around us? If there's a way that you can do that, you should do it, because it will give you the best long-term benefit. And take very seriously the idea of outright rebellion against the government, breaking the law in the name of the Lord. Because, as Paul is showing, that's not what God's asking you to do. Okay? There may come times where there is conflict, but that's not what we're here to do. Okay? Verse 11. Do this, knowing the time, that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. The night is almost gone, and the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly, as in the day, not carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. How do we sum that up? Well, in verses 11 through 14, the end of the chapter, he is summing up everything he's just said really in the last 2 to 3 chapters. Live at peace. Be a demonstration of God's love and grace and kindness. And really consider that your Christian faith and your life as a Christian doesn't happen in a vacuum. People are looking at you. People are watching you. People are judging you. And you might be all they know about Jesus. Live in peace with one another, Jews and Gentiles. Live in peace with the world around you, with the community, your neighbor. Those who throw stones, don't throw them back. And live at peace even with the government. That goes contrary to even things I feel sometimes, okay? But do it. Why? Because, hey, Jesus is coming back. And we don't know when it is. Paul probably thought it was going to happen a lot sooner than now. Paul, when he speaks about it, seems to think it might happen in his lifetime. He never saw it, and I think he firmly believed it was going to happen imminently. It hasn't yet, okay? But he says it is happening, and his statement is true. It's closer now than it was, because we only get closer to that day. So, since that's the case, our time is pretty short. Our time is short to get the gospel to everybody. Our time is short to convince everybody of the truth of Jesus Christ. Our time is short to share the gospel and to make it real to people, and so we got to use the time wisely. We can't get caught up in conflict with one another. We can't get caught up in the conflict with the world around us. We can't get caught up in political revolution and dispute. We can't get caught up in having a bad reputation. Verses 11 through 14 is the summation and conclusion of the practical things that Paul's saying in chapter 13. Be careful with chapter 13. That's a tough one, but a very important one. Consider it in the context of the letter. consider the letter in the context of who and when it was written, okay? And what he is saying ultimately is value peace above almost everything. Value peace and a good reputation. It is not betraying your faith, okay? It is not watering down your faith to say, I'd like to have peace with these people. Always value your peace and your reputation. Behave as people who are sanctified by the blood of Jesus Christ so that people can see it. All right? We're going to stop there. And if you have questions or comments, we welcome them. Facebook, YouTube, even there on the website, you can add those. Chapter 14 is coming up. Chapter 14, 15 are a lot of fun because as he's built his argument, all are lost, all are saved by Jesus. Righteousness comes by faith, not through the law. And then in these chapters we've been discussing the last month or so, you gotta learn how to work together and be kind to one another and be gracious to one another and take what Jesus did for you and apply it to your relationships and work well with one another, work well with outsiders, work well with your government. Why does he say all this? Well, he's serving the main theme of the letter, which is God wants his children to be one. He wants his children to be united with one another, not in conflict. So, as we get to chapter 14, he's going to now build on what 13 isn't really that out of place. We think it's out of place because it has a chapter heading, okay? But it's not like Paul just decided he would write a little footnote here about how we're to interact with the government. He's talking about all levels of interaction and relationship we're going to have as Christians and how we ought to deal with them. And we err on the side of peace and a good reputation, okay? We err on the side of furthering the kingdom and not ourselves. I mean, we could make a name for ourselves in a lot of ways that don't serve the kingdom. But we're here to serve the kingdom, and that means we have to have the respect of knowing we represent the kingdom to the people around us. So take that seriously. And as we get to chapter 14, we're going to talk about, okay, down to the nitty-gritty, rubber meeting the road. What happens when we disagree? What happens when we're arguing? What happens when we just think the other person is wrong? What do we do about it? We're going to get to that next week. I can hardly wait because I love these chapters. There might be some things that surprise you in there. There might be some things that frustrate you. There might be some things that give you hope. But whatever it is, hope you're here for it and hope you'll join us. We'll be back next week as we continue in the book of Romans right here. Take care and have a good rest of your week.